I'm Michelle Zuckerberg, and my role that I energize in the Department of Natural Resources, Natural Areas Management. So DNR, Department of Natural Resources, manages all kinds of timberlands across the state for trust beneficiaries. And they also do fire, and the department also has the aquatic bedlands management, and we have natural areas. So natural areas are both natural area preserves and natural resource conservation areas. And so I manage sites within the Puget Sound region that are either natural area preserves or natural resource conservation areas. And one of the sites I manage is here. It's Woodard Bay Natural Resource Conservation Area. And so it's everything here that's in this army green color. And Woodard Bay has been a natural resource conservation area since 1987. It was among the first NRCAs. It was actually listed in the Act, the NRCA Act, designating this site and a couple others around the state for purposes of conservation and low impact recreation and environmental education. So it's separated out from the preserve concept. It extended that, giving it more flexibility to look to sites that weren't necessarily these primary endangered species or rare plant communities. They were conservation value, but also included this opportunity for recreation and more influence around environmental education. So Woodard Bay is about almost 900 acres. It started as about 400 acres. It was acquired from Weyerhaeuser Timber Company because it was the South Bay log dump. So Weyerhaeuser brought their logs along the Seals Western Rail, and they dumped them here at Woodard Bay. And so that's part of why the site was not developed along the shoreline, which made it a conservation, a viable conservation area, and why it was available and not fully parsed out in the forest area as well. So that's where we are, and Woodard Bay includes the Weir Point will go out there, but this is Henderson Inlet, and both Woodard and Chapman Bays are surrounded by the conservation area. So I mentioned that Woodard Bay is an NRCA, and it has the recreation, education, and conservation values. And you can see that here on the map. How we are incorporating those things in the larger planning and management of the site. So there are multiple trails. We're going to go down one of the main trails here out to Weir Point. So that's a recreation trail people can walk, and a loop trail, and then there's a trail over on the Seals Western area we call the Overlook Trail. So people come to walk. There's no bicycling here, because it supports the conservation level and wildland protection. And what people can see when they come is a lot of this intertidal estuary environment. So that's a recreation. It's layered with environmental education. We have school groups that come out here and learn about the estuary. They learn about the seals and the bats and the cormorants and how the intertidal, the freshwater and the saltwater mix, and all the important things about Puget Sound. You can see right here this kind of microcosm of that. So out here we have an actual physical shelter for that. And then in terms of the conservation restoration aspect, we have all around the site various types of restoration happening. When we go out here, we can see all the nearshore restoration related to the log dump, some of the creosote removal, and that sort of cleaning up the Puget Sound part that's related. Over here, these are a lot of areas that are old farmlands, and over here that we're restoring into forest because they're part of the watershed, riparian habitats, and beyond, that we want this continuous forest habitat. And also what you can see is that this is a spotted map. So we don't have influence outside of the natural area boundary. I can't influence zoning in the county, development. So we can imagine that development will happen however it's going to happen. And my only domain in management is really what's inside the NRCA boundary. acquiring the lands in there, bringing funds in, I can potentially expand that. But it is a limitation to looking at this landscape level conservation. You know, what's happening in the larger watershed and how is Woodard Bay influencing or influenced by that. And we're going to go look at that out here. So we're out here in, this is Henderson Inlet here, and what we call now Chapman Bay. And this area such a magnet. There's so many layers of values, cultures that value this site. And so long ago, there's the tribal relationship, time immemorial. This is a site that has the ancestors of the Squaxin and the Squally and those tribes in the Medicine Creek Treaty all have a really strong relationship with Woodard Bay. There are many, many archaeological sites around here. They still have a really strong connection to Woodard Bay. The tribe Squaxin recently came out and harvested shellfish as part of their treaty right. And you can see here in the news, this is the tribal contribution to this interpretive site, which shows just how present they are here at Woodard Bay. So we have that relationship, and then fast forward way ahead, many, many, many years, and we have the relationship to timber and this commerce and extractive resource relationship of Washington's logging landscape. So, in fact, Woodard Bay is a registered historic and archaeological landscape with the federal government because of its tribal connection and because of this logging connection. And so the structures you see here, this pier, the Chapman Bay Pier, and we'll go over and see the other site, and all those pilings are all related to the South Bay log dump, which started in the 1920s and then ended in the 1980s. And thousands and thousands and thousands of logs came through the Seals Western Rail, you know, from all the nearby counties on the rail line, transferred to here, conveyed out into and wrapped up all together, rafted up, and then they went up to their mill. They were tugged up to their mill in Everett. And then the mill closed, and then Woodard Bay, the South Bay log dump was no longer needed, and then we have the conservation value that arises in the 80s. So it was a wanted site for conservation for the state. So all of these values, they're still here. We still have this presence of, you know, each imprint of human connection with the site. So the thing about the features from Weyerhaeuser log dump are they became really important habitat. The pier houses the largest known maternity bat roost in Washington state. So every year, around April, the mama bats come to this pier. They go under the pier. There are these stringers that are just so, you know, far apart, and the bats, about 1,500 mama bats come, and they're pregnant, and they have their pups, and then their pups, and the mama bats fly all the way to Capitol Lake, which is 8-mile commute, one of the longest known commutes of these bats going, you know, in North America. And they don't forage over the salt water, so they're going to the fresh water, and they're part of that whole ecosystem connection between this area and all the way down the line to Capitol Lake. But they're living in this creosote-treated pier material. So that's part of this management, you know, complexity of maintenance of this pier, and at the same time, in order to support bat habitat, but also to be protecting Puget Sound and water quality, we don't necessarily want the creosote. So that's the bats here. And then I guess I could pause for a minute. There's so many species of wildlife that inhabit this area. This is such a vital habitat for so many species, including double-crested cormorants and great blue herons. And those trees that you see over there that are dead, they were fir and cedar. The cormorants, just only a couple years ago, started nesting in those trees. And on the other side of those trees are the great blue herons nests that you can't see right now, but they're in the alders. And the great blue herons have been there for years and years. They moved from over in what's Chapman Bay over to this side that's Woodard Bay because the eagles were there, and so they're a threat. So they moved their whole nesting colony over to here, and they have maybe 100 nests. And now we've got the cormorants with, I think it was maybe 1,500 nests this year. So just over 3 years, they've grown so much that they are just kind of destroying the area in which they nest. The herons didn't quite have that issue. The whole understory, I don't know if you can see it, it's white with their poop, and that ammonia and all of that material ends up killing the understory temporarily. It also provides nutrients in the long term, but it's a whole mini habitat change just from this species of cormorants nesting here. And they've also expanded so much that they've moved over to, the cormorants have moved back over to Chapman Bay, and they're expanding into those trees there. So we've got, you know, a clump of dead trees here and a clump of dead trees there. From a management perspective, we say, well, this is sort of a natural process. The cormorants do this when they arrive. Their fledglings walk up and down the branches, they break off the branches, they connect with, you know, they have all their nests, and that's what happens. So what to do for now, we're just kind of seeing what happens. You know, it'll be a regeneration of the forest understory, and new species will come up. In terms of the larger landscape, I'm not quite sure. You know, what happens when our site, Woodard Bay, is containing so many habitats at once. So I talked about the bats that are in the pier. There's also the seals. The seals out there, actually you can see cormorants on those logs. All those little black dots are the double-crested cormorants that I talked about earlier in the trees where they nest. They also roost out here on this so much energy here. They roost out here on the booms and the rafts, the log booms from the log dump. So the log dump shut down in the 80s, and a lot of the remnant booms where the seals would haul out were still here for a long time. And because the seals, you know, Marine Mammal Protection Act in the 70s valued the seals, they're supported here from not being harassed, and their population has been thriving. In fact, this area in Henderson Inlet, this population has some of the best survival of their pups because they haul out literally on these booms, you know, that are between the pilings. They haul out, that's where they can nurse and molt and have their pups and all kinds of things. So it's really good habitat for harbor seals. And so we've been protecting that over the years as part of the Woodard Bay Conservation Area. In fact, it was part of the original management plan to have these seals, you know, protected. However, a major complicating factor is the relationship with seals and salmon. So seals eat salmon. It's a major part of their diet. It's not the only part of their diet. They tend to also be opportunistic, eating lots of different species, including some species that eat salmon species. But there is an impact. And so for us to be supporting artificial habitat for harbor seals where their population is not threatened, in fact it's thriving around Puget Sound, is not necessarily adding to the health of the rest of the web of the ecosystem here, you know, the various food chain web. Because the seals are also potentially eating Chinook, which is endangered in the Nisqually area. There's concern about that, the Chinook, and they do come into this area. So, and these seals have a range. So that's complicated. Of course, the relationship between the orca and the Chinook. So So what's happened over the years is the haul out has just sort of broken apart, and we haven't been actively replacing it because there's uncertainty about the impact to all the species. That's just part of the complexity of trying to manage parts of an ecosystem, which is what we've done. We compartmentalize parts, and that means we tinker with one and we've got to figure out the others. So that's the seals and Woodard Bay. So when we think about Woodard Bay as the ecosystems that are here and what we're conserving, why this site's so valuable, primarily I think about the fact that it's an estuary. It's multiple estuaries, actually. And the estuary is where the freshwater and the saltwater mix. And it's an extremely nutrient-rich system. And so you can see here this Henderson Inlet. We have Woodard Bay and Chapman Bay. So all of those systems where freshwater is coming in and meeting the saltwater of Puget Sound. We're in the southern fingers of Puget Sound here, the Salish Sea. And so the estuary includes water quality, it includes the movement of nutrients, it includes the large woody debris, all those things that are happening on the shoreline. And when we inherited the site or purchased it from Weyerhaeuser, we inherited all of their industrial improvements, that's what they were called, all of their industrial structures that were to lift a rail and dump the logs and convey them. All of those structures, in order to be in that marine environment, which is a very dynamic and water environment, means that there's rot. And so in order to deal with rot, there's preservatives. And that preservative that Weyerhaeuser used is called creosote. And so all these pilings and the pier, all the structures are just like saturated with this chemical. It's actually several hundred carcinogenic chemicals together, I think. That they call creosote. I believe that even in like a cubic foot, there's like 28 pounds of creosote. So those are some heavy pilings, and they're loaded with toxic chemicals. But that's how they stay fresh in the marine environment. So otherwise they'd be breaking apart. Well, we had to look at that. We had to look at that there was a trestle, that there was this pier, that there was 600 pilings, and say they support seal habitat. They support the largest maternity bat roost. There are all kinds of roosting, the cormorants and the herons and all kinds of things happening around these structures. I mean, they're loaded with shellfish and all kinds of stuff. So what do we want to do? We have to choose what we value and prioritize related to that restoration of the marine environment. And what we decided to do was to remove half the pier because we wanted to support the bat habitat, and to remove about 90% of the pilings so that we could maintain those the seal habitat and have enough boundary around them that people on boats and such weren't harassing the seals. And as I mentioned earlier, those logs have been breaking apart, and we kind of are letting them go. That's another decision that we're making. But all of those are still creosoted. So we're doing, we're weighing what we value here. And this is part of the site. So that's habitat restoration, part one. So in order to do that restoration, we had to do a lot of investigations, assessments and studies to find out, well, are we going to be just kicking up sediment that's all toxic too? What's happening in the marine bedland here? We had all these logs come in, and it's not like the sawdust mills where they find, it's extremely toxic from all that dumping of sawdust. Here it was just raw logs that were banging together, so all of their bark was creating this mat on the bottom of on the bedland. So we had a consultant come in and do these video probes where they dropped every so often, they would drop a video down into the sediment and see how much of that layer is bark, how much of that layer is biologically active. And what we found when we mapped all that was that the majority of the bedland has enough sediment that is layered on top of it to create a biologically active zone. So we left that be. We didn't decide we're going to dredge and we're going to do that level, and this is not necessarily a super fun site kind of level. But just around the pilings, because creosote, maybe its weight, it just, has like a 2-foot area around the pilings that we needed to concern ourselves, and a strip around the pier itself. So we were given the green light to just pull the pilings out. And there's a particular cost to all of that needed grants and permits and all sorts of things, and method, which includes the same way they put the pilings in. It's this thing that shakes them, kind of wakes them up out of the sediment and pulls them out. And when we pulled the pilings out, that creosote was still super fresh. And some of these pilings are 70 feet long, and they had this massive amount of, in the sediment creosote, just still like oozing with its oils. So yeah, that's the sediment story. So I talked about the NRCA, the values, the purpose being recreation and conservation and environmental education. And as part of the restoration, the final phase that we worked with was how to bring those things together in an interpretive site. So I'm standing on this, instead of taking things out of the site, this is where we put things into the site to tell that story. So this is the interpretive area. This shelter was built. Some of the steel beams are to represent the industrial history. There's these rail. Some of the rail was actually here at the site, showing this old rail line. And also here, this circle is representing the Native American presence here. This is the Squaxin tribe supported design of this with our landscape architect. These are representing salmon gills, and this has the basket patterns in the circle. So putting all these things together, just showing this is what's here, including the canoes. And then this swale here was not here before. This is not part of the original ecosystem. Neither is any of this point here. This was all built by Weyerhaeuser to connect the rail. So what we did was turn this into a bioswale. It became more of a rain distribution, rain garden, gathering the water and then moving it out. And we planted it with native species that would work in this environment. So they weren't necessarily what would have been here, but they are what can be here in this kind of environment, including certain grasses and aster and carex and some camas even. So that's some of the idea behind this particular site design. So one way to tell the story of the site is through these interpretive structures and features, like the basket pattern in the pavers and the canoes, various other things. The other way is through signage and pictures and telling the story, through that language. And so that's what we did here. We have this interpretive signage here that is a way to tell the story about the site. And I've noticed over the years, in trying to tell the story, that I put it in a linear fashion, that this is what happened long ago. We had the first people, and then we move into the Woodard family arrives, there's the Land Claim Act, the land changes hands, we have the Medicine Creek Treaty, we talk about the treaties, then we move into Weyerhaeuser, acquires the land, Weyerhaeuser has their mill, they do all this timber stuff here, the mill closes, it becomes DNR, conservation area, and then we have this huge restoration, and then protecting habitat and this legacy for future generations. So this is a way to tell the stories, but it does, it gives you the pictures of what happened, and it also has the potential to flatten the story. So, for example, how to show that the tribes are still here and there's still vibrant, active interaction with Woodard Bay. And I don't know what people experience. But in the process of doing this, we work with all kinds of people, artists, and interpretive assigned writer who's very good at distilling out complex stories into, just a few words. We have to figure out who's our audience. Are we targeting is this for a 4-year-old or someone who's actually going to be well reading this? Is it for a college-age student or someone who's older? So all of that comes into play. What pictures to choose? How do we convey this? How do we have the site history that isn't told just by the structures that are being here? How does that come through in the signage? So these signs take a long time to work through and get the language right, and this is what we end up with. So if you were here, like the classes that have come before you that were able to come out here, you might be in this canoe all together, and we would be taking a picture of you. We have years of that, of your classmates from before coming to Woodard Bay and supporting the learning and carrying the story of the site and the restoration, caring for the land. So we've been with your classmates in the past out to various areas. I showed you the map earlier. It had all those areas that didn't necessarily touch the water, but they're part of the watershed. So a lot of those spots are, they have had a house on them, or they are farm area. Even here, this is not old road. It's harvested, it's growing. So there, sites back to riparian habitat, upland forest habitat. And your classmates have helped remove irrigation, tubing that has been laid, and is now the trees have grown, so we had to pull that up, help with weeding. Over here where I talked about the cormorants, that you can see the extent of their devastation. Right behind there's another trail, and we've gone with your classmates several years in a row, I believe, to do trail work, because that trail, having that open, having people connect with the land, supports its healing and also their healing, and also ideally conservation in the future. Life funds and other resources will come here. So, so you've been out there clearing this land, and you would be there today if you weren't in these particular circumstances. What else about that? Oh, so we're also here in this area. I didn't mention, but I want to say the list of all the species that Woodard Bay supports. That all of this restoration, is enhancing and impacting. So we talked about the seal, the harbor seals, the bats, the eagles. There are also peregrine falcons that have come into Woodard Bay over the years, and they actually hunt the bats in the evening. So there's purple martins that are in boxes on the pilings. There's eagles, there's the overwintering waterfowl that comes into this inlet, and there's the Olympia oyster. There's a remnant population here of Olympia oyster, which is the only native oyster in the West. So many species supported here at Woodard Bay, and all these